Let's do it.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to NOVA's virtual forum, Cleveland's Redistricting, Transparency versus Political Power Games. My name is Bishop Chewy, and I'll be serving as your moderator tonight. At NOVA, Northeast Ohio Voter Advocates, we are a grassroots organization dedicated to expanding voter participation so that all voices are heard in our democracy. We focus especially on amplifying voices in underrepresented areas of our community and improving the election process across Ohio. Through research, advocacy, and the pursuit of meaningful legislative and administrative changes, we work to build a system where fairness and transparency takes precedence over politics. Tonight's discussion is particularly important because redistricting has a profound impact on the integrity of our democracy. It shapes the representation we have at every level of government, determining whose voices are heard and whose are marginalized. Unfortunately, Cleveland's current redistricting process has raised serious concerns about transparency, fairness, and political maneuvering. We're here to unpack some of that and then talk with, we're here to unpack some of the issues and then learn from our expert panelists and explore how we can all play a role in ensuring a redistricting process that truly serves the people of Cleveland. Thank you for being a part of this vital conversation, and let's get started. We're incredibly fortunate to have three distinguished experts joining us tonight to share their insights on Cleveland's redistricting process and its broader implications for our city and our democracy. Kayla Griffin serves as the Ohio State Director of All Voting is Local and is the current president of the Cleveland NAACP. With a strong background in community organizing, Kayla is a fierce advocate for voter rights and election protection. She holds a JD and a Master of Public Administration from Cleveland State University, along with a bachelor's degree from Kent State University. Her tireless work ensures that every voice is heard in our electoral process. Matthew Ahn is the director of the Beyond Guilt Project at the Ohio Justice and Policy Center, where he leads post-conviction release advocacy for over-sentenced individuals. In 2024, Matthew ran for Cuyahoga County prosecutor, earning an impressive 41% of the vote as a first-time candidate. Before his campaign, he was a beloved law professor at Cleveland State University, voted Faculty Member of the Year by his students in 2023. A lifelong Ohioan from North Royalton, Matthew is also a board member of Bike Cleveland and Cleveland Stonewall Democrats, a world-ranked Sudoku solver, a former Jeopardy contestant, and a two-time Guinness World Record holder. Noor Kelly is an ERISA attorney and a resident of Cleveland's West Park neighborhood, where she lives with her husband and son. Before entering the legal profession, Noor spent a decade empowering low-wage workers through her work with the Service Employees International Union as both a union staffer and an elected officer. She later served as the director of the DePaul University Labor Education Center. Noor earned her law degree cum laude from Seattle University School of Law and holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Xavier University. While at Xavier, she was a two-time captain of the women's soccer team and received the prestigious Paul O'Connor Award as the school's top senior female scholar athlete. Each of our panelists bring a unique and powerful perspective to tonight's discussion, and we're honored to have them with us. Please join me in welcoming Kayla Griffin, Matthew Ahn, and Noor Kelly. Next, we're going to pass it over to Matthew Ahn, and he's going to lead us with his presentation.
I think we're gonna really quick do a little audience participation first, if that's cool. And then I'll make Matthew the host at the end of that. But yeah, Bishop brings up a lot of important issues about why redistricting matters on a systemic level and how it impacts like whose vote is counted and how it counts. I think like on an individual level, what it comes down to is when you get redistricted and disenfranchised in that way, it just feels like your voice isn't being heard or respected. Like on a personal level, that's how I feel about it. And so I'm curious to know, like, from you all, what is a time? I'm going to drop a link here that you can use to participate in this. But if you can describe a time when you feel like your voice wasn't being heard, whether that was in an election, in a workplace, in a faith-based institution, a school setting, like a group project, maybe a family gathering dinner table. I sometimes have felt that way in that setting. But if you want to click the link here in the chat, it will take you to our Padlet where when you click the little green button, here, I'll go ahead and share my screen too so y'all can see um, what it's going to look like for you. So you'll see like the little green plus sign down at the bottom, and you can add your response to that question, and it'll pop up on the map, and we'll see kind of like what folks are thinking. So I felt like my voice wasn't being heard living in a heavily gerrymandered state. Do I know how to spell gerrymandered? I should. State in a red county. Because I grew up in Lake County, and I often felt like I was just not being heard. Still got people coming in here. And if folks are having trouble accessing that, drop something in the chat and I will try and help you out there. But I see a whole bunch of people, and these can be anonymous. You don't have to put your name. You can if you want to, but otherwise it'll give you some kind of like anonymous name, like um, Happy Badger or like something silly like that. Cool. I see a bunch of anonymous folks popping in. Yeah, I'm gonna let a few responses populate and then I'll start reading them out for folks. Okay, there's some tea here that I need to know more about. Yeah. So yeah, I see one that says, when people think Asian is silent, so just skip you during a civic and political conversation, that is so real. I see one that says, in the 6 p.m. meeting about gentrification plans of Herman Avenue. That sounds juicy. I feel like I need to know more about what's happening on Herman Avenue. I see one as a transplant from a blue state. I felt like my voice wasn't being heard living in a blue city and county, but in a red state. Yes. It feels like you're on an island sometimes, right? Everyone just talks about how regressive Ohio can be sometimes. And yeah, that's very real. I still see a few more folks typing. Uh, when I worked for local government, yeah, for sure. When officials ignore public records requests or take a year to answer them, that sounds very frustrating for sure. Um, yeah, oh man, there's so many popping up. Okay, here we go. Folks are commenting on each other's. That's great. Yeah, when trying to coordinate services for community members and folks with the resources don't believe in sharing. Indeed. As a young person on a board with tenured folks. Okay. Uh, Ooh, I felt like my voice wasn't heard when the ballot board approved the dishonest language for issue 1 amendment. I heard a lot of similar things. Yeah, a lot of folks saying just being in like a blue city in a red area can be, and probably the vice versa of that in other places might be true for some folks. Um, yeah, a lot of good stuff popping up here. I will keep adding these so you all can see them, but thank you all for sharing. Yeah. Oh yeah, university hospitals destroying solid lower income housing. Oof. All right. Lots of good stuff here. I'm going to pass it over to Matthew now. And I think what I'm going to do, Matthew, is I'm making you the host temporarily, right? So that you can share your screen. That's the workaround we found. Where are you on the list? But thank you all so much for sharing. That's like very real stuff. Cool.
All right, how's it going, everybody? Can everybody see my screen? All right, excellent. I'm going to go ahead and launch into my presentation. And I know that a lot of folks have thought a lot about gerrymandering in the last several months for obvious reasons, which I have some feelings about. So some of this may be review for some folks, but if folks have any questions, actually, hang on. Let me make sure that I can actually see the chat, just in case. Go ahead and drop any questions in the chat, and I will try to keep those in mind as we move forward. All right. So, how do we think about fair maps? How do we think about what gerrymandering might look like in the city of Cleveland? And, we know that there's a long history of gerrymandering in this country. Does anybody happen to know who this is? Oop, oh, you can see all. Okay, let me get rid of this. And if the chat continues to get in the way, I'll move it around. But yep, somebody put it in the chat. That is Elbridge Gerry, and yes, his name is actually pronounced with a hard G. He drew this district back in the year 1812 and decided that he wanted a district that would be safe for him, and some newspaper editor decided it looked like a salamander, and therefore we have the term gerrymandering. Of course, we've seen a lot of gerrymandering in the last couple of redistricting cycles. Here, for example, is a Wall Street Journal op-ed from about 15 years ago called "The GOP Targets State Legislatures." Note who wrote this article. This is an article that was actually written in the Wall Street Journal by Karl Rove, basically telling us, hey, the Republicans are going to try to gerrymander your state legislative districts after the 2010 elections. And that is exactly what happened. Now, of course, a lot of the gerrymandering that we talk about is partisan gerrymandering. So, of course, many of you have probably seen a graphic that looks like this. There are a couple of different ways to draw fair districts, but there are only a few ways to draw unfair districts. And you can often, based on the way that the lines are drawn, tell whether a district is gerrymandered or not. Apologies, I'm a little sniffly, so please bear with me. And of course, we have seen politicians in both parties draw lines that benefit their party when they have the power of map drawing. Of course, we know what the Republicans have done in Ohio at the state level. We saw the shenanigans, the lengths that they would go to over the course of the issue one fight this year. But it's not limited to just Republicans. Democrats similarly gerrymandered Illinois' congressional maps, with each of those Chicago districts up in that top right, sort of encompassing a very heavily Democratic part of the Chicago city proper, and also extending into the suburbs to catch some lighter red areas so that every single one of those urban and suburban districts was solidly blue. As it turns out, regardless of what checks we put in place, politicians tend to not be able to resist the urge to consolidate their own power. You have to sort of put even greater protections upon them. And so, of course, the question is, how does this work in Cleveland? And we'll come back to that question. It's important to remember, I think, in the bigger picture, that gerrymandering is itself voter suppression. Now, what do I mean by that? So this is the cycle that we often see in any kind of gerrymandered district. Whether those Districts are drawn by Republicans, by Democrats, or even in nonpartisan races. You see elected officials in these gerrymandered legislative bodies that make decisions that aren't in line with what their constituents want. And they don't have to be because they know that their seat is safe. This results in quote unquote minority voices are not being heard. And I don't necessarily mean racial minorities. We could be talking about Democrats in Ohio. We could be talking about people of color. We could be talking about LGBTQ folks, any number of different marginalized communities or minority communities. Voters then become discouraged with the lack of improvement, or in some cases, active backsliding, and they may choose not to vote at all in those races, or perhaps just simply not to vote entirely. And of course, in a state where it is as difficult to vote as it is in Ohio, that happens fairly frequently. And of course, if those folks don't vote, or at least don't vote in those races, those same elected officials who may be unrepresentative of their constituents get reelected. And this means that there's no meaningful accountability to voters. Voters lose trust in the system, and the cycle will continue. And there are a lot of consequences when you draw these non-competitive districts. Does anybody recognize this guy? If you do, drop a message in the chat. Aha! Got a couple of folks who got it. That is our good friend Larry Householder. We'll see if he gets some kind of clemency from our incoming president. But it's important to note that the first energy corruption scandal was only possible because the districts in the Ohio General Assembly were so gerrymandered as to be functionally fully safe for Republicans. And this is a quote directly from the federal criminal complaint against Householder. The enterprise spent money on approximately 21 different candidates, 15 including Householder in the primary, 6 additional candidates in the general election. Most of these candidates won the 2018 general. All who won voted for Householder as Speaker. All but 2 voted for the legislative bailout of First Energy. In other words, creating districts that are this safe allows bad actors to manipulate the safety of those districts for their own personal gain. And that's a real problem. And of course, I'm not saying that every single legislative body is necessarily going to be ripe for this kind of scandal. But of course, we have seen that even maps that are drawn for incumbent protection, aside from the state level, can lead to folks using those seats to act perhaps less than particularly well. And of course, I do want to note the 2 examples that I was able to pull here. These both happen to be Black local elected officials, but that, of course, is not it's not a question of race. We know that these kinds of incentives to act poorly sort of know no bounds, whether party, whether anything else. So the question is, of course, well, how do we apply these partisan gerrymandering lessons at the city council level? And the answer is, it's not going to match up quite 1-to-1. It's important to note Trump won 0 Cleveland precincts in 2024. So basically, however you cut up the city, all of the possible wards will be Democratic. We are in this situation because we have 17 wards and we need to drop down to 15. But the name of the game in a solid one-party city is instead incumbent protection. And so, of course, the question is, are these maps being drawn in order to keep neighborhoods together? Are they being drawn to make sure that we have communities of interest that are represented? Or are these maps being drawn in order to make sure that the game of musical chairs is a little bit easier to be played? Now, many of you have probably seen the current 17 ward map in Cleveland, but I'm curious for folks to take a look at this map real closely and think about what really sticks out to you just in terms of the ways that these wards are drawn. Now, we'll get into sort of toward the end of this presentation some things that we can look for, but are there any sort of geographical oddities that stick out from the last round of redistricting back in 2013? I see a number of people mentioning the Scorpion's Tail, this sort of northerly section of Ward 11. We've got Ward 12 straddling the east and west side. I love the comment, 10 is a wild shape because it sure is. There's a lot going on here. And now I want to be careful because not every ward that's drawn in kind of a weird shape is necessarily going to be a problem, but we've got a lot of weird shapes going on here. And a couple of people are pointing this out. I think Ward 3 is actually kind of interesting because it's got this sort of Western appendage that sort of pushes into Ward 14 as well. Sort of a sleeper contender in terms of potentially the way these things are drawn. For me, the most ridiculous one is actually Ward 6. We've got this like tiny thin neck between these two much larger portions. You know, these are just sometimes some of the things where it's like, okay, why is it drawn that way? Is there actually a geographic reason for it to be drawn that way? We need to look a little bit closer. And here's the thing. Bad maps, when we're just talking about incumbent protection, they're actually kind of easy to spot. It's not that difficult to identify a bad map. You can see, of course, that maps that are drawn for incumbent protection often lead to very, very oddly shaped districts. Arguably, I would say only 6 or 7 of our 17 current wards are compact, and the rest have some weird borders that oftentimes were meant to draw people in or out. Not all of them that are weirdly shaped, but many of them. And so, here are some principles that I think it's actually important to keep in mind when we're trying to tell a good map from a bad map. First, how often do ward lines follow physical boundaries? Things like rivers, things like highways, things like railroads. Note that I don't include major streets in that question because oftentimes major streets actually run through the center of a cohesive neighborhood. And so using a major street as a dividing line can often actually split a neighborhood into multiple pieces. Question number 2. How often is a cohesive residential area split between 2 or more wards? Question number 3. How often are insular communities, such as the Latino population on the near west side, kept together or split between multiple wards? There's a law called the Voting Rights Act that tries to take care of some of this, but it's a little bit broader than what the law provides. And finally, the one that I usually like to use, do far opposite corners of a ward feel like they could reasonably belong together? And if the answer is no, then it's often worth thinking about, hey, what else is going on in terms of the ways these maps are being drawn? So, um, I would love to yell about this all for like a whole hour, but just a quick exercise here. And what I've done is I've drawn 4 different potential maps for the city of Cleveland. These are all 15 ward maps. We have to drop from 17 to 15. And I want folks to think about just, I'm obviously not giving these to you with any advance notice. You're not really looking at them for like 15, 20 minutes each. But I am going to sort of cycle through each of these 4 maps. And I want folks to take the next couple of minutes, think about which maps look good to you, which maps look less good to you, what concerns do you have, and what questions do you have? If anybody is bold enough, if you want to try to rank them from most to least favorite, say, I'm just going to sort of cycle through them for a bit here. So this is map number 1. Map number 2. And I'm probably gonna just cycle through 3 or 4 times. I'm gonna stay on each one for about maybe 30 seconds or so. Here's map number 3. And here's map number 4. All right, let me circle back to map number 1. Oop, there's map number 1 again. Here's map number 2 again. There is a request in the chat to sort of overlay what we have currently. The tricky thing about that, right, is that we're losing 2 wards. We're going from 17 to 15. And so, unfortunately, I don't think I have a way to do that real quickly here. But but I do want folks to think about, we do basically need to draw a new set of wards. There's not really a way to do like a minimal change. There's going to be a lot of change somewhere in the city. I've given this presentation a couple times. I've actually tried a map drawing project from scratch, and it's actually very interesting because folks do kind of gravitate to, hey, what do the wards look like now? But we know that the way that the wards look like now, not necessarily ideal either. Here's map number 3 again. And here's map number 4 again. I'm going to cycle through one more time. Um, got some rankings in the chat. Um, our esteemed state representative-elect points out using existing precincts also perpetuates current odd boundaries. I did go down to the census block level for all 4 of these maps. So while you got some kind of weird internal borders, I did try to slice it up as much as I could in a way that would make sense. All right, I'm going to go back one more time. Here's map number 1. And I'm hoping there's a way that this presentation can actually get sent out to everybody. I neglected to ask our organizers that at the beginning, but hopefully you'll have a little bit of time to sort of peruse all of this on your own after this presentation as well. Map number 2. I feel like this is almost everybody who ranked their least favorite. I wonder why. Map number 3. And finally, map number 4. All right, so we got some love for map 3 in particular. Looks like folks seem to not particularly like number 2, and there's some difference of opinion on 1 and 4, which is sort of about what I expected. So here's how I went about building these maps. Got 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 1. So here's how I decided to put together these maps, and this might be interesting for folks. So map 2 is specifically drawn to protect as many incumbents on the east side of Cleveland as possible. Almost all of the population loss in the city of Cleveland has unfortunately been on the east side of Cleveland. And so what I think we're seeing a lot is like folks on the east side trying to jockey for position. If we wanted to protect every single east side incumbent, I think that the least bad map is actually map 2. But this goes to the point of when you are trying to protect incumbents, it's going to be pretty obvious, right? This sort of tealish ward that runs along the lake all the way from Lakewood to University Circle is the result of trying to do about that much. Um, it's, as I said, it's fairly easy to tell. Map 4 was actually specifically drawn to eliminate the ward of retiring Councilwoman Jenny Spencer and of Council President Blaine Griffin, sort of in the fanciful situation that he might run for mayor. Otherwise, it is generally as little change as possible. But it is a map where all 15 of the other council folks would get to keep their seats. Now, there are still some tells there that it is a map drawn for incumbent protection, but it's a lot more subtle than map number 2. I'm going to go back one more time. You can notice, for example, that Collinwood is still split north-south. And there is sort of a lot going on here in Ohio City, which ends up being split between 4 different wards. Now, of the remaining 2, this is interesting. Map 1, and this is me playing a little bit of a trick on you. I think map 1 looks okay on the surface. But if you look closely, the wards that are created don't actually follow many natural boundaries, and there are almost as many neighborhood splits as map 2 and map 4. For me, of all of them, map 3 is the best, which follows lots of natural boundaries. This is the one that I actually did submit to the city. It's not necessarily perfect either. I'm not saying I have all of the answers, but I do think it is a map that shows how we can sort of create compact districts that do represent whole neighborhoods as much as we can within the constraints of trying to draw districts in a city with some kind of weird boundaries. And so the last question I'd like to pose to you before I hand it back over, which of these maps do you expect the new wards to look like? And of course, what can we do with this knowledge? Where do we go from here? Where is sort of the status of all of this map drawing? What are we anticipating next? I am hoping that our other panelists will be able to, let me stop my screen share, will be able to discuss these topics in detail. So I'm going to hand the host duties back over to Maggie.
So thank you so much for sharing all of that and for all the work you must have put in to make those maps. That's like, I can't even imagine. I thought I had a brain for logistics, not even close. Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think if you all hopefully heard the introductions of the 4 speakers at the beginning. If you already have questions that you think you want to ask them, you can start dropping them in the chat. And I have not seen any pop up. I know Sid is also is mainly looking for those. Maybe if you do see them, Sid, and you want to like bump them, like copy and paste them to the front of the chat, that might help. But I know Bishop, you had a couple questions ready to go, and I will hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Maggie and Matthew. I want to direct the first question to Kayla and Nora. At Northeast Ohio Voter Advocates, we register thousands of voters every year, and one of our concerns is about voter apathy. When folks feel like their vote does not matter, we want to make sure that they know that they're a part of this democracy and what they do matters. And so my first question is, how does this impact representation? How does the redrawing of ward boundaries affect representation in Cleveland? Are there examples of communities that could be underrepresented or overrepresented as a result?
I think I got off mute first, so I'll jump in and then I'll let Nora follow up. Thank you so much for this amazing discussion. Matthew, thank you for the presentation. One of the things that we often see when we're out in the field talking to people is like, my vote doesn't matter, so why should I do it? That is a very common occurrence. But that doesn't mean that folks aren't interested in the process of politics and what is happening. And so, I've been screaming this from the rooftops, from council persons to state reps. If we want to see better voter engagement and civic engagement, we have to allow people the opportunity to work in the system and flex their muscles. We have been screaming fair maps from the rooftops since 2015. If you remember, folks remember we had the fair maps that created the bipartisan commission on the state level take place back then. And we saw in this last iteration on the statewide level how that just did not work, how politicians really played games with people. And it made people really disheartened, me included, as someone who does full-time advocacy in my work. Really disheartened with this process because the people who are elected to serve us thump their nose at the system, at the constitution of the state. And so I have been trying to let people understand that the slogan that I use and that I coined is that voting is just the front door to the mansion of democracy. There are so many different levers that we can be pulling, so many different levels that we need to operationalize, and getting involved in a map making process is one of them. And so I would hope that city council would take the same approach that we were really pushing on the statewide level, because we've been following through. We see what has worked, at least in Michigan, where they just pushed through a ballot initiative. And my hope was that we would see a lot more transparency and civic engagement around the process, regardless of how the outcomes would be or things like that. And the last thing I will say is that uh, now we are pushing up against time and we're running against the clock, but we didn't have to be like this. Like we knew that we needed map. We knew that we needed new maps. And so we could have started this process a lot sooner and we could have had a robust engagement process, but that was a decision made by our council. So I'll leave it at that and I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, Kayla, I think that was like I'd love to be able to follow up on that. I think you're exactly right. Folks that are doing this work all of the time, issue one really did feel like a gut punch. I remember watching the ballot board make the determination to put the ballot summary language that they elected to do. And if you watch the ballot board proceeding, there's actually audible gasps from the audience, which is really telling because these are folks that are following this really closely with just how over the top what Republicans did with the measure after all of the grassroots work. But I think, in my view, what we could really be an alternative here in Cleveland, right? We can hold up, even though we don't have a process that models issue one. We can really engage in a process that looks much more like what we would like to see at the statewide level, and we have an opportunity to sort of hold up an alternative to what we're seeing happen in Columbus. And so I think if we want to sort of build trust and also model the sort of small d democratic way that we want to see our elected leaders lead, it's really just an amazing opportunity. And I kind of want to really sort of underscore, like, this didn't have to happen in such a rushed way. We've had the census data for long enough to do this in a really meaningful and intentional way. And then I guess I would offer maybe one other view, which is sort of on the governing side, which is when we see those the sort of impacts of what happened in 2014, the sort of the scorpion in Ward 11, right, where communities don't feel like they're fully intact, it has governing implications. And we just saw there was a really heated neighborhood disagreement about a zoning issue. And the neighborhood was weirdly bifurcated, right? So some folks were deemed as being allowed to weigh in on that because they away, and we're not deemed as being residents of that ward to make that particular decision. So you do see then the real world implications, which I think does lead to frustrations from residents. But I feel really optimistic that we, even in a short timeline, that we could sort of offer up an alternative to what the Republicans have done in Columbus.
So, Kayla, you talked about the timeline and that we're now in a time crunch. Can you give us a little bit more about what that time looks like and what the deadlines are now?
Well, I believe we have to have maps in the according to the charter and the ordinance, we have to have them by April 1st, if I'm mistaken, somebody told me. But I was asking, I started having conversation with city council members back in, I believe, late April or early May of this year. Like, this is not a this didn't sneak up on us. And I'm like, so, who are you hiring? What are you doing? Like, have you put out an RFP? And there was crickets, right? There was crickets. And so here we are in December. We probably will see a map maybe before the end of the year, but it's Christmas time, right? And so that leaves us within less than 4 months for them to actually pass a bill, pass the maps, vote on the maps in a way that is meaningful. And I think that the fact that the public has yet to see it is the thing that I am turning back to. That we have an opportunity for transparency and for people to at least weigh in, whether or not you were going to change it or not, whatever. But like, allow us to see and voice our opinion on, what makes up a community and what feels right and natural to us. I think the other thing is that there, from a governor's perspective, I don't know that our leaders expected so many people to be as tuned in to the reapportionment process. And I think that is, a misstep on their behalf, given we just went through as much as we did, particularly around the ballot process. So I think people are a little more cued in and zoned in. And transparency is what I hope that in these last few months that we are at least able to see. That people can go to public comment and state their claim. I was very encouraged. I know it's taking place right now, but I was very encouraged to see over the last week that people went to public comment and stated, what their community meant to them and what it means to live in a particular ward, and what neighborhood means. We went through all of this on the statewide level, and it was cathartic to go to public hearings and commission meetings and to tell people about what it looks like to live in our neighborhoods, regardless of how they decided. We were able to flex the muscle of civic engagement, and we want more people to be able to do that.
Yeah, I would say, like, we want those honor ups. I wanted to maybe just add two things. One, really bit of what I think is a bit of very good news, which is folks may have, right before we jumped on this call, City Council released a press release that they're going to be having a 3 p.m. Media availability tomorrow to release the maps, a set of maps, I think. So this is sort of late breaking news. So hopefully that means that we have time in advance of them having final consideration of the map. I don't know what that looks like exactly, but my understanding is it's a 3 p.m. media availability tomorrow, which I hope is sort of in response to so much, as Kayla said, so much resident engagement around, following this around issue 1 at the state level, but folks following here at the city level. Hopefully it's in response to residents really saying we want to be able to have that degree of transparency and an opportunity to provide meaningful feedback. The other thing that I would add, in addition to the charter obligating city council to have those maps finalized in April, my understanding is that the Board of Elections is saying because of the May general election that was not anticipated, that they really need the maps by early January in order to be able to pull off that election. So again, like, had we started that process earlier, to Kayla's point, if there were any contingencies that cropped up, they would have been prepared to deal with it. So I think it speaks to that question of also not having such a sprint to the finish, regardless of what the timeline is, so that there was a process that allowed folks to sort of meaningfully engage, but also pivot in the event that something unexpected happened, which, often happens these days. A lot of unexpected stuff comes down the pike. So just a quick addendum to that, but could not agree more in terms of, how optimistic I am in seeing that many people show up and engage in this. And I think we want to create meaningful on-ramps so that we have additional folks across the city doing exactly that to make us more resilient not here just at the local level, but we're going to be facing some unprecedented threats nationally. And so the more that we can build our sort of democratic muscle, small d democratic muscle here in Cleveland, the better off we're going to be in the fights that we face. Again, sort of the uphill fights at the state level, but also at the federal level is just sort of my maybe bit of like too much of a partisan hat, but I think, something for us to consider.
Matthew,
And
did you want to respond to that?
yeah, I'd also like to just piggyback on a couple of Kayla's comments because I think they're on point here. I just went back and looked because I've given public comment twice on the city redistricting process, and the first time I went was April 15th. So that was almost 8 months ago at this point. And yet we did not get a public meeting on the redistricting process until what was it, the first week of October. It was about a week of notice, and we were told at that time that you could submit your own map, but you had to do it by November 3rd, the Sunday before the election. And I know that a whole lot of people who are here, who are interested in this issue, are folks who were kind of busy in the month of October this year. And so it was just an interesting choice of timing. And I do want to point out, transparency is one thing, but I think that there is the sense, I think that council is sort of saying, oh, this is a very transparent process. It's more transparent than last time. I think that's true, but it is still possible to transparently do bad things. And I think Nora brought up Frank LaRose at the ballot board earlier. That is an example of having transparency, but absolutely no meaningful input, no meaningful way to collaborate and to provide feedback. And there's a difference, I think, between that transparency and the collaboration and the listening that I think the people of Cleveland deserve.
Those are all great points. Now, what specific steps can be taken to make this process more open and inclusive for the public? Are there best practices from other cities that Cleveland might be able to take on?
I'll
I
defer
was
to
I was going to
Nora.
offer something up going forward, but Kayla, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I'll defer to Nora on this one.
I was going to say, like, I think there's the short term question, but I think the sort of medium and longer term question is really looking to the incredible work developing issue one and thinking about modeling that here at the local level with charter reform. Because I honestly think like it is like sort of a very difficult position to put council leadership in to have to each every 10 years be drawing these lines. And as we've seen, like the outcomes in 2014 have long been sort of condemned in terms of the outcomes, but also that we're seeing a process that folks don't feel great about this cycle as well. So if we think about using charter reform to model sort of the best practices of that partisan commission, to Kayla's point, which really seems like Michigan, that issue one really modeled itself after, is having the best results. And so it's like, let's look to those places that have been able to model what we want to see happen. So I would just throw that out there as sort of a medium or longer term consideration that I think is really worth us contending with, right?
I'll just echo that to a smaller degree and call our attention to like ballot initiatives are how we engage in direct democracy. And I think they are tremendously important. I was super encouraged when we got the win in August around like direct democracy and supporting and keeping one person, one vote in the state. But I also think back to like when we had issue 32 participatory budget and the great lengths that city council and the power system went to ensure that participatory budget did not get passed. I am increasingly frustrated with government officials not abiding by and listening to those who elected them. And so I think that if we're going to be thinking through these aspects, it's going to be all hands on deck. We will need to educate all the people because they are going to throw so much at us in order to confuse, lie to, and just deceive the people.
Yeah, I think as a follow-up to that, the one thing, sorry, I was going to jump in with one. I love that comment. I think the one question is always, I think the key question for all of us is like, do we have elected leaders that are punching up or are they punching down, right? Like, are we punching up against corporate interest and folks, or are we having folks that are sort of view their role as disciplining residents, right? And so I think the question is like, or do we have partners that want to figure out how we're building that small d democratic muscle, right? And I think they're very different. They can be very different approaches to governing.
Okay, I have two more questions, and then we're going to move on to questions from the audience. The first one is about the conflict among council members. Um, we have seen some conflict, including allegations of political targeting. How can council members work together to prioritize community interests over personal or political rivalries?
I mean, I think that when the decision-making process is taken out of the politicians' hands, it allows them to um, focus on governing and allows the people and the experts and folks who are appointed to these commissions or boards to actually keep an eye on the prize that we're doing this for the people and we want their representation. I just don't know that we can entrust our politicians to fairly represent our interests while they're also trying to reserve their jobs.
Is there an opportunity for our elected officials to regain that public trust?
I mean, I think that there's immediate steps now, right? I think I will be honest. I think the release of the maps, if they're released tomorrow, is certainly encouraging compared to when they could have been released. In terms of in early January, for example. So I think that that's a step in the right direction. But I also think it means the regaining the trust means understanding that there may be disagreements, right? But also doing it in a way that is trying to amplify the feedback and the voices of residents in the community, and also understanding that the role of residents is often to hold elected officials accountable. So there's always going to be a dynamic tension, right? And then tension is not necessarily to impugn people's integrity, but the roles are fundamentally different. I think that that's an important thing for us to contend with, right?
Thank you. And we have one question from Melba. Will redistricting change again before the next election?
On the city level, no, unless we do a time amendment, and on the state level, because it did not pass on issue one did not pass in the state. So now we'll be stuck with the same process that we have now.
And Anne asked, I wondered about the meetings with the consultant. Were they made available to the public under the Public Meeting Act?
They were not. I know a number of folks requested, made public records requests. There were a number of folks that did that. There were a number of social media posts encouraging folks to make public records requests. My understanding that none of those public records requests have been fulfilled, and that in some cases, some of those records requests have been denied up until this point, which is
At one point,
which is
City Council,
unfortunate. Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Which is unfortunate since the maps will be released tomorrow. Because I think what people want to fundamentally understand is what difference there are from the maps that the council members were given a preview of and what is being released tomorrow. But without the city engage, filling those records requests, we won't know sort of what the difference is between, again, what was previewed and what will be released tomorrow at 3:00.
So to your knowledge, will the maps that were submitted from the public be released tomorrow?
Oh, the public records. I think that this is my understanding based on the press release, which was pretty limited, was that they're going to release the maps that council will be considering voting on, is my understanding the way that it was crafted.
Okay.
I don't know if Matthew, if you had a different understanding of that.
The press release is pretty minimal. So I don't think we are being promised anything other than the current draft of the maps. I know that I and a couple of other commenters had asked for the maps that were submitted by folks and some kind of explanation as to what from those submissions was considered and what the decision-making process was. My understanding is that that's at least not part of what we're getting tomorrow at this time, but I think we'll sort of have to wait and see. And I think we've got about 4 weeks before the date that folks expect the vote to take place, which is January 6th of next year.
I did just get a direct message here that Mark Sailing is on the call, and he is the actual map maker. So maybe we can turn things over to him to see if he can let us know if the other versions of the map will be released, and whether we'll see the version that council members saw last week. I'll turn things over to you, Mark.
Is
If we can
Mark
unmute him.
available? Maggie, can you unmute Mark, please?
Good evening. I'm afraid I can't comment on your question at this time.
Thank you. We respect that. So one last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Nora for a call to action on how residents can get involved in the process and become more engaged, and possibly hold our public officials accountable. And the last question is, who has political leverage to apply pressure on Blaine? He's holding the power to allow for more participation, right?
Ooh.
And that question is from Ann Armstrong. Does anyone want to take that?
I'll try, but I think that it's not, we have the power. We as the electorate have the power. And I want us to be able to see just even the movement that has been made over the last like 2 weeks. The people have the power. Voters have the power, and we need to be able to engage in that. Like, call his office, leave messages, ask for meetings, show up to, I know we're on right now when they're, typically meeting the city council, but the people have the power. And that's why I say that, like, elections are just the front door. There are other ways to talk to and engage our elected officials. They work for us. And so, we need to look, I really appreciate Nova and all the work that Nova always does, but like bringing us together so that we can hear good information, be able to ideate together and come back and say like, hey, we're gonna, do calls tomorrow at 1:00 or right after their release to submit our concerns or our questions or our pause. Even if we like them and we want to say, hey, this is great, like, let's call the office and say, hey, this is great. Thank you so much for releasing them. Thank you for the transparency. Keep up the good work. We don't, I'm an advocate. We're in ACP. We're always blowing down on everybody, but we can also give people the good head nod and that, a hat tip if they do well. And so I think the answer is like, we have the power, and we have so much more power when we operate together. So like, let's do it together.
Thank you so much for that answer. Nora, I'm going to pass it over to you as we close out. How can people get more involved? What do residents need to do to hold our elected officials accountable and possibly bring out a better process in the future?
Yeah, so I wanted to just make a quick plug. A number of residents that have come together over the last couple of weeks helped craft the Fair Maps Pledge. It's 3 very simple things, right? Immediately release the maps that council members saw, allow for reasonable time for meaningful engagement of residents. And then the third is this whole charter reform, thinking about how we have a independent process, taking the politicians out of the map making moving forward for the next cycle. So it's 3 very specific things, 2 immediate things and 1 longer term, medium term thing. And so I'm gonna add into the chat here the link to that website. And you can ask your city council member to sign the pledge, right? So encourage folks to ask their member of council to sign the pledge. We've had Councilwoman Jenny Spencer posted on social media today. She has signed the Fair Maps pledge and is encouraging colleagues to do the same. Councilwoman Rebecca Moore signed the Fair Maps pledge. So I think the goal really over the next week is to get as many folks to sign on to that, to build momentum. I think both to have better maps this cycle, but also to think about how we have better structural ways to address map making going forward. And so that would be one big immediate step, call to action that folks could take right now.
Thank you so much. And finally, can you all share the information that was sent out today about the press conference for tomorrow? Is it open to the public? If not, will it be live streamed? Will the public be able to interact at all?
Matthew, do you have the link to the press conference? My understanding is it's a press availability. I think that does mean it's open to the public, though. And it's at the City Council hearing room at 3 p.m. tomorrow at City Hall 601 Lakeside.
Thank you so much. And so the information about that is in the chat. I want to thank all of our fabulous speakers for coming out and all of you who have participated. We're Northeast Ohio Voter Advocates, and we're advocating on your behalf. This is an issue that is very important to us because we believe it's going to be very important to you. We will be staying in touch and we'll be communicating about how this issue has gone forward. We encourage you to sign the Fair Maps pledge and send it on to your council people. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Night.